Before kings raised banners or men dared carve their names in stone, the world breathed beneath a single tree. Its light was hope, its shadow a warning. But from the wound where night first bled, a whisper crept across creation, soft as mercy, sharp as ruin, promising power to any who listened. And so the ages turned, empires rose, empires burned, and the silence beneath the roots began to stir once more. For every age of light is born from the bones of the age before, and the darkness that watched them fall has never forgotten. The Call of the Shards. Dunya, the birthplace of Nishi, a world where power is born through wisdom, shaped by sigils, and paid for in blood and memory. Across its lands, rulers and wanderers alike tell stories of triumph and tragedy, tales of kingdoms raised beneath banners of gold, and kingdoms buried beneath ash just as quickly. But at the heart of every story ever told lies a truth many wish had remained buried. And across the realms there is one tale above all others, one whose truth has been smothered beneath centuries of lies, denial, and regret. A story spoken only in whispers of a land of endless green far to the east, for beyond the reach of most maps, and farther beyond the reach of reason, stretched a jungle, one so vast, so ancient, that even its furthest reaches seemed without end. Stories claim it to be the sacred wound of life itself, the place where the world first drew breath. And from that breath, the jungle was born. Across the world, tales speak of explorers witnessing the unexplainable, and survivors returning with stories too impossible to believe, of armies marching proudly into its depths, only for their drums to fall silent without explanation, leaving no trace they had ever existed at all. In time, the jungle became a warning spoken in every realm, a place only the foolish dared enter, and whatever returned was never the same. From those warnings, a name was born, a name that would follow it until the end of days. One said to reflect the hell that resided within those depths. The Green Abyss. But within the Green Abyss itself, other stories were told. Stories passed from elder to child beneath dim firelight. They spoke of darkness that watched too closely, and of the things that waited within it, of creatures that walk the earth as shadow itself, beings with no known origin and no known end. Devilous. Kale had grown up hearing those stories. His village was said to be nearly as old as the jungle itself, or at least, that was what the elders claimed. They spoke of a ring of wooden houses resting along the western edge of the Green Abyss, clinging to the continent like burrs upon a cloak. He told himself he didn't believe most of the stories. Some were said to be as old as Hergotz itself, tales passed down for so long that nobody truly knew where they had begun. But Kale enjoyed them regardless. Hergotz was a quiet village, wooden homes and narrow walkways raised above tangled roots, and damp earth beneath the endless shadow of the trees. At its center stood the Elder Hall, a great wooden structure where the 5 elders gathered to settle disputes and pass down stories older than the kingdom itself. Hunters came and went through the outer gates at dawn, with bows and blades strapped to their backs, while sentries watched from the wooden walls, offering quiet wishes of safe return. Life in Hergotz was simple, hard, but simple. For across the abyssal villages, one rule stood above all else. The jungle provided, and the jungle took. Because of that truth, Kale had never known his parents. They had ventured beyond the trees and were never seen again. He was raised by his grandmother until her passing years later. Since then, Kale had lived on his own for years. But even alone, he never truly felt like a burden. There were many orphans within Hergotz. The jungle had seen to that. Yet Hergotz was the kind of village where no child was ever truly left alone. Everyone carried their part, even the children. Some hauled water along the river paths beneath the village bridges. Others carried wood for the cook fires, cleaned game brought back by hunters, mended nets, or ran messages between the homes and the elder hall. And Kale, like many others his age, often traveled between the neighboring villages carrying supplies and goods where they were needed most, which was exactly why, on that particular morning, Kale found himself heading back from Lee Village with a supply pack slung across his back. The northern road from Lee Village was little more than a worn strip of dirt, winding through tall grass and thorned brush beside a slow-moving river whose name Kale could barely remember. Far to the east, beyond the rolling hills, the land disappeared beneath a veil of mist, the first reaches of the green abyss, where the trees grew too tall and the shadows too deep. He was less than a day from Hergotz when it happened. Crossing a weathered wooden bridge stretched over a deep pit below, Kale heard something. He turned toward the sound, scanning the trees around him. Yet, there was nothing. Must have imagined it, Kale muttered to himself. He continued, pace more steady now, every few minutes looking over his shoulder. Then he heard it again. Kale snapped toward the sound, his hands tightening around the straps of his pack. He was certain of it now. Something was moving along the tree ridge to the left of the path. He watched the trees closely, searching for anything that shifted, anything that could have been making the sound stalking him through the brush. Then, something moved behind the trees beside the road. Kale didn't hesitate, he ran. Books skidded across the wet mud behind him as he sprinted down the path. But to his horror, the sound only grew closer. He dared not look back, yet the pounding through the brush made one thing painfully clear. Whatever it was gaining on him. And then he felt it. A hand burst from the brush and seized his shoulder. "Hey, kid, you know it's dangerous being out here this early?" Kale's eyes slowly opened. Standing before him was a young man, not much older than Kale himself. His attire wasn't of the abyssal villages. A cloak bearing the symbol of a crow rested over his back, its edges lined with red, black, and blue patterns. In his free hand rested a spear, finely crafted, far beyond anything forged within the villages. The man spoke again. "Hey, kid, I'm talking to you." Kale blinked, the situation finally settling in around him. The young man gave a faint smile. "Sorry if I startled you." "I wasn't scared," Kale replied quickly. The man glanced back down the muddy path, retracing Kale's scattered footprints before letting out a quiet breath. "My apologies," he said calmly. "I stand corrected." He turned back toward Kale. "Still, why are you out here alone?" Beside them, the brush shifted once more. Kale's eyes snapped toward it instantly. The man beside him watched quietly. "Relax," he said. Before long, the source of the noise revealed itself. 3 men stepped from the woods, each wearing the same crow-marked uniform as the man beside Kale. "Well now, what do we have here?" Another stepped forward beside him, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked Kale over. "We heard screaming," he said. "Thought something happened." His gaze shifted between Kale and the scout beside him. "Everything all right?" One of the men stepped forward, tugging at his beard as he looked Kale over. "Such a young lad. Where might you be headed?" "I'm not that young," Kale replied. The man studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the scout beside Kale. The scout simply shrugged. Turning back to Kale, the bearded man smirked faintly. "How many summers?" 16, Kale answered. The man let out a quiet laugh. 16, and already talking back to graybeards. What village are you from? Hergotz, Kale replied. The man's brows lifted slightly. Hergotz, huh? He chuckled to himself. They really do raise tough ones out there. He stepped closer, resting a hand on Kale's shoulder. Name's Bran. We're scouts from the River Kingdom. The first scout stepped forward once more, coming to rest next to Bran and Kale. We were just heading toward Green Coast to trade out with another scouting team. Bran turned, glancing north along the road ahead. If I'm not mistaken, Hergotz is about half a day from here. A faint grin crossed his face. My old pal Captain Rhine should still have a scouting party near that area. He looked back toward Kale. His gaze drifted downward, settling on Kale's boots. Wet. Mud caked heavily along the sides. Bran lifted his eyes once more. You crossed the Batitsu River, didn't you? His expression softened slightly. I imagine you're exhausted. Kale said nothing. In your condition? Bran continued. You won't be much of a fight if something happens out here. He gestured toward the road ahead. You should travel with us, Bran said, a bright smile spreading across his face. We'll drop you off on the way. I've made the walk before, Kale replied. The first scout turned toward him with a faint grin. I'm sure you have, kid. But the truth remains. His eyes drifted toward the scattered footprints pressed into the muddy trail behind them. If I were a panther, he said calmly, things wouldn't have ended well for you back there. Kale flushed at the remark. He wanted to argue, but he knew the scout was right. Bran turned back toward the road ahead once more. Then it's settled. The quicker we move, the quicker we get you home. Without another word, Kale reluctantly nodded and fell in beside the group. Together, they continued along the jungle road, moving beneath the endless canopy overhead. Before long, one of the scouts glanced toward Kale. Hey, kid, I don't think I ever caught your name. Kale gave the scout a faint smile. It's Kale. Ah. The man returned the gesture. Name's Ben. The younger scout glanced over from beside him. Forgive me for not introducing myself earlier, he snickered. You were kind of caught up in everything. But my name's Xavier. He gestured toward the man beside him. And this is my older brother, Jacob. Jacob offered Kale a quiet wave. Bran laughed from the front of the group. Well met, Kale. Look at us now. One nice little family, comrades of the abyss. Jacob nodded in agreement before glancing toward Kale. You ever thought about becoming a scout? Xavier looked over with a grin. Yeah, Kale. The way you moved back there, I'd say you'd fit in just fine. A faint warmth crept into Kale's cheeks beneath the praise. No, he admitted. I've seen plenty of scouts come and go through Hergotz, but I never really thought about becoming one myself. Well, if the thought ever crosses your mind, remember me, Xavier said. I'll make sure they put you with a good squad. Kale gave him a small smile, unsure whether the younger scout was joking or truly meant it. Ben glanced back toward him as they continued along the jungle path. Speaking of Hergotz, that's one of the older villages, isn't it? Kale nodded. We're stationed near Leaf Mist pretty often, Ben said, rubbing his chin. Their firewater's pretty famous around these parts, you know. A faint grin crossed his face before he waved the thought away. Jokes aside, we usually relieve scouts who've been stationed out here too long. Kale looked at him in confusion. Ben waved the question away before Kale could ask. It's too complicated to explain, but don't worry about it. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with, especially since you were born in this place. He paused, then glanced toward Kale again. Anyway, I've heard some of the village sentries talking about stories their elders told them when they were younger. Something about creatures called devils? Devilous, Kale corrected. Ben snapped his fingers. Ah, that's it. Yeah, I've heard a few things about them too, Xavier added. Mostly from travelers and merchants back in Veilstone. They say the stories speak of nightmares that walk. His brow lifted slightly. Whatever that's supposed to mean. You're partly right, Kale said quietly as he stared ahead along the path. My grandmother used to tell me stories about fields swallowed in black, skies filled with their wings. His expression tightened slightly. And others, she said, were even more dangerous. His voice slowly faded as memories of evenings beside the fireplace returned to him. His grandmother seated close to the flames, her face half lit by their glow, while shadows danced across the walls behind her. They weren't all shaped like shadows, young one. Some bore faces of their own and walked dunya as men do. Her voice seemed almost real again. Beware the Devilous that... Laughter suddenly snapped Kale from the memory. It was Jacob. He shook his head, still chuckling. You honestly don't believe those old fairy tales, do you? Fairy tales indeed, Bran added. The old scout's gaze traveled slowly across the immense trees surrounding them. I've heard plenty of stories over my many years. Tales from this very jungle, and others from lands far beyond anything most men here will ever see. Bran chuckled softly. My old friends, Captain Rhine and Shipmaster Timothy, used to tell me of places they claimed to have seen in our younger days, before Rhine became one of the 3 commanders, and, of course, before Timothy's accident. Ben glanced toward him in surprise, his eyes widening. Shipmaster Tim. He stared at Bran. The blue whale? You never told me you knew the blue whale. Bran gave a quiet nod, and for the first time since the conversation began, something almost wistful touched the old scout's face. Aye, that name brings back memories. The blue whale, he chuckled softly. There's a funny story behind how he came by that name, but yes, I knew him well. He was a good friend of ours, a good man, and the greatest captain I've ever seen take to the sea. His smile weakened, though I wish things had ended differently for him. For a moment, Bran's expression grew distant, as though the memories had carried him somewhere far beyond the jungle path beneath their feet. Timothy used to speak of cities built on scales most men couldn't begin to imagine, fashioned from things you'd swear no sane hand could build with. Floating cities of bone and crystal, inhabited by beings of every shape and size. Some looked like us, yet were different in ways he could never quite explain. Ben glanced toward him. Different how? Bran chuckled. Wings, for one. Ben's eyes widened. Like angels? Bran gave a small shrug. Who knows? Timothy swore by what he saw, but the man had a talent for bringing back stories no sensible person knew what to do with. He chuckled to himself. Still, Timothy's voyages had a habit of bringing back things even the most learned scholars could scarcely explain. Maps whose markings seemed to shift and rewrite themselves when no hand had touched them. Books filled with histories belonging to kingdoms no one had ever heard named. Weapons forged in fashions unfamiliar to any known smith. Treasures sailors swore carried curses upon them, and stranger objects still, fashioned from materials that seemed to lend truth to some of the very sightings men had once laughed at him for claiming. Bran gave an amused shake of his head as they continued beneath the canopy. After enough of those things found their way onto scholars' tables, it became rather difficult to dismiss everything else the man spoke of. So, whether they believed his stories or not, they wrote them down all the same. Bran glanced upward through the canopy, amusement creeping back into his expression. If you ask me, Timothy knew they'd record whatever he told them once he'd earned enough credibility. A few of the scouts laughed softly. And then there were the other stories he spoke of, the darker ones, the sort of tales that could keep a believer awake long after the fire had gone cold. The laughter faded. Bran continued as they walked, though now his voice carried a different weight. Stories of entire towns swallowed by cults devoted to dark deities, of wild men roaming endless plains and forests, attacking anything unfortunate enough to cross their path, of books that spoke of wars waged by god-kings in ages so distant they were said to have come before the first men ever walked these plains, islands where the creatures were stranger than the people living beside them, and places so unnatural that those who returned from them spoke of things no sane mind should have been able to imagine. He gave a faint shake of his head. Monsters, cities, lands, things so strange that simply hearing Timothy describe them was enough to make a man call him a liar. What were some of the stories they didn't believe? Ben asked, curiosity spreading across his face. Bran smiled at the question and continued speaking as they walked. Story after story followed, memories of distant shores, old voyages, and friends whose paths had long since carried them elsewhere. Even Kale found himself listening. For a time, the jungle around them seemed almost forgotten as Bran spoke of places none of them had ever seen, and of things some had never even heard whispered in stories. The memories appeared to lighten the old scout's steps, and I've witnessed things with my own eyes that most men would consider every bit as unbelievable. Bran slowly shook his head. Yet when it comes to these so-called Devilous, his gaze drifted toward the darkness between the trees. I've seen nothing but stories. They're real, Ben said almost immediately. Or at least, that's what my cousin told me. Bran glanced toward him. Ben continued. He said he served aboard one of Shipmaster Tim's vessels. According to him, somewhere within the Balis Kingdom near Tyr, there was once a king who managed to bind one of the creatures to himself. Bran burst into laughter. You mean the tale of King Reverend? Ben nodded. The one where both the king and his beast are supposedly poisoned? Bran asked. Ben, even the tale itself places those events sometime during the Third Age. Ben merely nodded again, as though that somehow strengthened his argument. Bran gave him a long look. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this the same cousin who claimed he slew a dragon? Xavier laughed beside them. And kissed a mermaid. Ben shrugged. Doesn't mean everything he says is a lie. That earned another round of laughter from the scouts. Kale, however, remained quiet. Bran shook his head before turning his attention back toward the boy. Never mind them. His amusement gradually faded as he surveyed the trees lining either side of the path. I have 2 sons myself, barely older than you or Xavier. They sail aboard Timothy's son's ship now, under Captain Wayne, a magnificent captain of the sea in his own right. A faint pride entered Bran's voice. Timothy and I used to fill all 3 of their heads with stories much like these when they were younger. Bran glanced back toward Kale. Devilous are just that, boy. Stories. Nothing more. Tales meant to keep children from wandering too far into the darkness. For a moment, his expression grew more serious. Believe me when I tell you, this place is dangerous enough without the things from those stories walking around in it. Before long, the smoke of torches appeared in the distance, an old, familiar sign to those who knew how to read it. The village was not far ahead. At last they reached a cliff that opened beneath the sky, and as they stepped to its edge, Hergotz revealed itself below them. Villagers moved through the early hours of the morning, children played within the gates, and sentries patrolled the walls and the inner and outer roads alike, a welcome to some and a warning to others. Bran smiled faintly. We're almost there. He glanced down the steep descent and gave a quiet chuckle. Unfortunately, we can't fly. Still, we should make it before the sun rises completely. His eyes shifted toward the path leading down through the trees, though at this hour, that road gets dark beneath the canopy. Then something in the distance caught his attention. Beyond the smoke rising from the village, another plume lingered in the air, small, faint, and easy to miss. But Bran knew at once that something about it was wrong. Its position did not fit. His expression tightened. That has to be one of Captain Rhine's groups. The others followed his gaze and saw it for themselves. Ben was the first to speak. "Do you think it's a distress signal?" Bran pulled his spear free. It spun once in his hand before settling at his side. At once the others followed suit, readying themselves as well. "Devilous are one thing," Bran said, his voice growing harder. "But bandits, panthers, and worse roam these woods just as freely." Then he looked toward Kale. "Stay between us. That smoke is along the path to Hergotz. We'll check it out first, then get you to safety." Kale nodded and quietly moved into place between the men. Xavier rested a hand on Kale's shoulder and gave him a reassuring grin. "Don't worry. This isn't one of those stories. There are no Devilous waiting for us out here, and nothing else in this jungle is getting to you while we're around." He lifted his hand from Kale's shoulder and gave him the scout's salute, holding it for a moment as though the gesture itself were a promise. "You have my word." Bran gave a single nod. "Let's move." And without another word, they began their descent into the darkened path below. The deeper they moved, the quieter the jungle became. The scouts glanced about uneasily. "It's too quiet," Ben muttered. Xavier nodded, his eyes shifting toward the trees around them. "Even the bugs have stopped." Bran raised a hand at once, calling for silence. He knew too well what such stillness meant. In all his years beneath the jungles of the world, he had learned one truth above all others. The wild gave signs, and silence was among the worst of them. It meant only one thing, that something was near, something the rest of the fauna did not wish to be noticed by. Bran's pace slowed, and the others matched him at once. Together they moved down the path at a hurried yet measured speed, every step careful, every eye alert. Before long, the fire came into view. It was a campfire laid with distress silk that sent a plume of pale white smoke curling into the air. A distress signal indeed. Yet no one was there. The camp sat untouched. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no broken ground, no bodies. Jacob's brow tightened as he looked around the clearing. "What's going on here?" he said quietly. "Something's not right." From the brush at the edge of the clearing came the sudden sound of rustling. Every one of them turned at once. Xavier pulled Kale behind him as the scouts leveled their spears toward the bushes. The sound grew nearer, closer, closer still. Then it stopped. Bran's spear began to glow faintly, a soft yellow light gathering along the sigil carved into its shaft. His eyes narrowed. "The way you move is no beast," Bran said, lowering himself into a guarded stance as the faint yellow glow along his spear brightened. His eyes remained fixed upon the rustling brush ahead. "You stand before scouts of the River Kingdom. Show yourself at once." For a moment, nothing answered but the trembling leaves. Then came a ragged voice from somewhere beyond them, broken apart by harsh coughs. "Please, don't attack." The weak voice came in a rush, and a man stumbled from the brush with one hand raised. "Bran, is that you?" He hurried across the clearing as quickly as his body would allow. Bran's eyes widened. "Lieutenant John?" He moved toward him at once. "What happened? Where are your scouts?" John made it only a few more steps before his strength gave way, and he doubled over. That was when Bran noticed it, a gaping wound along the man's right side, one hand pressed desperately against it as blood seeped between his fingers. John struggled to catch his breath, his face pale with panic. "They killed them," he managed at last. "We never stood a chance." A violent cough seized him, and blood spilled from his mouth. His trembling hand lifted from the wound to wipe it away, before immediately pressing against his side again. "Calm yourself," Bran said, steadying him. "Tell us what happened." Jon tried to open his mouth to answer. When he heard it, they all did. His head snapped toward the woods behind him, terror flooding his face. "They're coming," he rasped. Jon began dragging himself backward, every movement strained, his eyes never leaving the brush, as though he already knew what waited beyond it. We have to go." His breath caught in his throat, and he forced the words out with what little strength remained. "We have to get out of here, now!" Bran immediately stepped in front of him, spear ready, his gaze fixed on the bushes across the clearing. Something was coming. It was fast, far too fast to be any scout. Bran shoved Jon aside just as the brush exploded outward. What burst from it was something none of them could properly understand at first sight. A hand. Yet the arm behind it did not end. It kept going, stretching impossibly from the darkness like the body of some great serpent, thin and wrong, and reaching far farther than any living limb should have been able to reach. Bran struck on instinct. His blade met the thing with a sharp crack, and his eyes widened. The flesh was hard, hard as stone. The arm lashed past him and wrapped around Jon's leg. "Help!" Jon barked as it began to drag him backward into the brush. Bran gritted his teeth. In one swift motion, he traced another sigil along the shaft of his spear. The yellow glow flared brighter, and with a single clean strike, he cut through the extension. A shriek tore through the woods, and the severed hand released Jon at once. The others rushed forward, dragging him back to safety. "What in the hells is this?" Ben barked, staring at the writhing appendage on the ground. The thing was like nothing they had ever seen. Its edges bled into dark mist, making it impossible to fully focus on. It moved like a snake, yet there was no mistaking the clawed hand at its end. Bran did not move. His gaze remained fixed on the trees ahead. The spear in his hand blazed now like a small sun, and Kale had never seen such a thing before. "Is this magic?" he thought. The light was brighter than any fire he had ever known, flooding the clearing in yellow and daring whatever hid within the dark to reveal itself. And from the shadows beyond the tree line, as though answering his challenge, something did. Kale had seen panthers before. He had seen bandits. He had seen the sorts of things that usually moved through this part of the abyss, if only from a distance. This was none of that. It moved wrong. The way its head jerked, the way it twitched, too fast yet somehow too smooth. Its limbs bent in ways Kale's eyes refused to understand. The appendage Bran had severed appeared to have been its tail, and it writhed behind the creature as though it still felt pain. Bran took a step forward. "Men, positions. We make for the outpost immediately." "What is that thing?" Ben barked. Bran never took his eyes off it. "I'm not entirely sure." Kale's eyes widened in horror and disbelief. The way it looked, the way it moved, those red eyes reflecting through the dark. The stories from his childhood crept back into his mind. They're only stories, right? The creature lunged. It was fast, but Bran was ready. He slammed his hand to the ground, and the sigils along his spear began to hum softly. At once, the earth beneath him erupted. Spikes of stone shot upward toward the creature one after another, but it dodged them effortlessly, closing the distance between them all the same, only for Bran to rush forward himself. The spear shone in his hand as the two collided. The old scout gritted his teeth and drove the creature back several feet, forcing it away from the others. Then, with a twist of his body, he heaved it over his shoulder and slammed it hard into the ground. His free hand carved a sigil in the air, and with a sharp motion upward, the earth rose beneath the thing, pinning it in place. Bran mounted it at once, The spear in his hand blazed brighter than ever as he drove it down, piercing the creature and the ground beneath it alike. Bran fell off to the side, catching his breath. At once, Ben and Jacob rushed to him. "You two stay with me," Xavier barked, glancing back toward Kale and John. "Forgive me, Lieutenant, but in your condition—" John raised one hand weakly, the other still pressed against the wound in his side. He was too drained to answer, his labored breathing saying enough. Kale, however, could not have moved even if he'd wanted to. What he had just seen, that creature, the power Bran had wielded. What was all of this? Too much was happening at once, and before he could make sense of any of it, the creature let out another cry. The men covered their ears. "What is it doing?" Ben shouted. "Is that an attack?" "No," Bran said, his face turning deathly serious as realization struck. "I think it's calling something." "Calling what?" Ben barked. "Help," Bran answered and surged forward at once, intent on silencing the thing before it was too late. Ben and Jacob rushed in beside him, spears ready. Kale's eyes remained fixed on the scene before him when he heard it. A whisper. It slithered beneath the creature's shrieks, so faint it almost seemed separate from the sound around it. Kale glanced back at once. He could not place it, yet he knew what he had heard. It was as though someone had stepped just behind him and breathed into his ear. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Then it came again, this time from the brush ahead, and though the others gave no sign of hearing it, Kale was certain now that the whisper was real. Before he could even find the words to warn the others, he saw it. Red eyes. One after another, they opened in the shadows beyond the clearing, scattered through the woods like coals, catching flame in the night. Kale's breath caught in his throat. He glanced toward John. The lieutenant had not even noticed the danger gathering behind them, too consumed by the wound at his side and the effort it took simply to remain conscious. Without turning, Kale reached out and tapped Xavier. The young scout did not look back. Kale tried again, this time grabbing a fistful of Xavier's cloak and pulling hard enough to finally steal his attention. Xavier glanced down at him, confusion crossing his face, until he followed Kale's stare toward the darkness behind them. The moment he saw them, his expression changed. Before he could react, a shadowed appendage burst from the bushes and wrapped itself around John's leg before snapping back toward the dark. John cried out and reached for Kale. Kale caught his arm and tried to pull him back, but the strength behind the thing was too great. Xavier lunged and drove his spear down at it, yet the weapon glanced off with a harsh crack, like iron striking stone. Before the others could reach them, John was dragged screaming into the darkness. The scream was cut short. For a single heartbeat, neither Kale nor Xavier could even process what had happened. Then Bran was there. He seized both of them and shoved them aside, just as another appendage shot from the brush where they had been standing. "We have to move," Bran roared. "Now!" The group broke into a sprint. Behind them, the shadows erupted. Roars answered from every side, countless roars, rising through the jungle as they fled from the clearing and onto the path beyond. What little light had managed to slip through the canopy was swallowed behind them, and with every step they took, the trail grew darker, as though the night itself were chasing at their heels. "We have to reach the outposts," Bran barked. A shadow lunged from beside the path. Bran turned and cut it down before it could reach them. Another dropped from above almost immediately, but he was already moving. He surged upward, bisecting the creature in a single strike before driving his boot into one half and sending it crashing back into the darkness. He landed without losing a step. But his breathing told a different story. Each breath came heavier than the last. Years of battle had sharpened Bran's instincts, but age was beginning to demand its price. Then something moved from his blind side, A creature burst from the shadows toward Xavier. Bran turned. Too far. He would never reach him in time. Xavier spun toward the attack just as a spray of red washed across both him and Kale. He wiped frantically at his face, his vision clearing only enough to see Jacob standing between them. Xavier's eyes widened. "Brother!" Something had torn straight through Jacob's stomach. Jacob's hands locked around the protruding length, gripping it with everything he had, holding it in place as though sheer strength alone might keep the thing from reaching those behind him. "Go!" Jacob barked. Bran seized the young scout and shoved him forward. "We have to move, Xavier." Bran dragged him onward as the others continued running. Xavier twisted back desperately, and Bran allowed himself one final glance over his shoulder. Jacob still stood there. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. Jacob gave them a faint smile. Then the shadows overtook him. Xavier gritted his teeth and forced himself onward, tears trailing behind him as he ran. The trail ahead seemed endless. The farther they pushed, the darker the path became, and if not for the light pouring from Bran's spear, they would have been swallowed by complete darkness. Then Kale heard it again. His head snapped toward the side of the trail at once. Bran noticed the movement, and Xavier, still half looking behind them, followed Kale's gaze. "Ben!" Bran barked. Ben turned just as a violent gale tore through the woods. There was no time to think. He grabbed Kale and hurled him backward toward Bran and Xavier, only a heartbeat before the force struck. Ben was ripped from the path and sent flying into the darkened woods. Kale hit the ground hard, breathless, his eyes wide with shock. That was... Bran never finished. They heard it. Another one. And this time it was coming straight for them. Bran slammed his hand into the ground. At once a wall of stone erupted upward between them and the side of the path. The gale crashed into it with explosive force, shattering stone and sending shards in every direction. Bran threw himself in front of Kale and Xavier, shielding them as the broken fragments rained across the trail. Then, without wasting a moment, he drove them forward again. His breathing had grown ragged now. Even so, he did not stop, and neither did the shadows pursuing the three. Though the shattered debris had bought them some distance, the roars remained close behind. They were still coming. Bran glanced over his shoulder, then toward Kale and Xavier running beside him. His pace slowed, then he stopped. Xavier made it several steps before realizing and turned back. "Bran?" "Go," Bran said. Xavier stared at him. "Keep following the path. The outpost isn't far." Bran turned fully toward the darkness behind them, the glow of his spear washing the trees in pale yellow light as the distant shapes drew nearer. "This graybeard has been around for many years. I know my body better than anyone." Bran gave a tired breath. "At this rate, I won't last much longer. Not while fighting these things back." His grip tightened around the spear. "If this body is going to fall from exhaustion, then it will fall fighting." He glanced back toward them. "As scouts, it is our duty to protect those who come after us in line." Bran's eyes shifted toward Xavier. For a moment, the urgency of the chase seemed to fall away, leaving only the old captain and the young scout who had followed him through the abyss. "Xavier, it has been an honor walking beside you and the others. I wouldn't have wanted anyone else beside me in my final days." His expression softened, though the exhaustion weighing upon him never left. "I have only one last request, a small one, from your former captain. Protect Kale for me. Get the young man back to his village." Xavier's eyes widened at the words. Bran's gaze moved toward Kale. "Get out of here alive, both of you." Then his eyes settled firmly on Xavier. "That is an order," Bran said, offering the young scout a faint smile. Xavier stared at him, but before he could answer, Bran raised a hand and gave them both the scout's salute. Then he reached for the sword at his side. The blade slid free with a sharp whisper of steel. Bran ran 2 fingers across its length, tracing a sigil into the metal with the ease of a motion performed countless times before. A faint hum answered him, and the markings flared to life in a warm yellow glow. Without another word, he tossed the sword toward Xavier. Xavier caught it against his chest, his eyes still fixed on Bran. "Bran, wait!" Before he could argue, the old scout lunged toward the approaching darkness, spear in hand. "Go!" Bran barked one final time. Kale stood frozen for a heartbeat, watching as the light from Bran's spear raced farther down the path. For several fleeting moments, its golden glow flickered between the trees. Then it began to disappear beneath the shadows. Xavier grabbed Kale and shoved him forward. "Move!" Kale stumbled into a run. "North toward Hergotz," Xavier shouted as he followed close behind. "Don't look back." Rocks and roots broke beneath their feet as Kale stumbled along the path. Branches whipped across his face, and the dark of the jungle pressed in from every side. He no longer knew where he was going. He only knew it had to be away. Behind them, the sound of steel striking something hard faded beneath the chorus of roars, still hunting at their backs. What are those things?" Kale asked between ragged breaths. I don't know," Xavier answered. But the uncertainty in his voice said more than the words ever could. Xavier risked a glance over his shoulder. Red eyes burned in the dark behind them, closing the distance with every passing second. "I have to find somewhere to hide you," he said. Kale looked up at him. "What about you?" Xavier gave no answer. Then, just ahead of the path, a massive elder tree came into view. Its trunk was enormous, ancient, and split at the base by a hollow wide enough to swallow a man whole. "There!" Xavier barked. He grabbed Kale and shoved him toward it, pushing him down into the hollow at the foot of the tree. "You have to stay quiet," Xavier said, his voice hard now, leaving no room for argument. "No matter what you hear, do not come out." He tore a strip from his tabard and pressed it into Kale's hands. "Like it or not, you're one of the scouts now," he said, "and this is an order." Kale blinked, the weight of everything that had happened slowly beginning to settle around him. He could not answer. Shock still held him where he sat, his fingers tightening around the strip of cloth, as though his body had forgotten how to do anything else. Xavier only gave him a faint smile, the same easy smile he had worn when they first met. "Sorry for pulling you into all of this," he said softly. Then he turned away. Bran's sword settled into his hand as he stepped before the hollow and faced the approaching shadows, bracing himself for whatever came next. Kale wanted to run from the hollow. He wanted to help, but fear drove him deeper instead. His back pressed against the farthest wall of the cramped space as the roars outside grew louder. He could hear Xavier fighting, steel cutting through the dark, boots tearing across the earth, the scrape and clash of something hard meeting Bran's sword. Kale kicked desperately at the ground, as though he could somehow force himself farther back than the hollow would allow. Then he heard Xavier's voice. What are you?" Xavier screamed. The sound tore through Kale. A moment later, Xavier crashed into the clearing before the hollow. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Xavier tried to push himself back to his feet. He coughed and blood spilled onto the ground beneath him. That was when Kale saw it. One of Xavier's hands was gone. Still, the young scout did not stop. With his remaining hand, Xavier drove Bran's sword into the earth. The sigils along the blade flashed, and a wall of stone erupted from the ground between them, sealing the hollow and cutting Kale off from everything outside. Kale could no longer see him, but he could still hear him. The impact of something heavy, the sickening crack of bone. Xavier's cries of agony. Then those cries weakened into wet, broken groans. And slowly, they stopped. Kale did not blink. He did not breathe. Fear held every part of him completely still. Then the stone wall exploded inward. Fragments burst through the hollow in every direction. One jagged shard tore into Kale's shoulder. He bit down hard against the scream rising in his throat, his feet still scraping uselessly against the ground as he tried to push himself farther into a place with nowhere left to go. He squeezed his eyes shut. His thoughts tangled. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. Outside, something heavy moved past the hollow entrance. The earth itself seemed to flinch under its weight. For a heartbeat, a shadow fell across the opening. Kale dared not look. He curled in on himself, forehead pressed to his knees, hands over his ears as if he could press the sounds out of his head. The screams echoed there anyway, chasing themselves in circles. "They're only stories," he told himself. "Only stories. Only—" The forest went quiet. Too quiet. Kale stayed in the hollow, shaking, listening to the sound of his own breath and the drumbeat of his heart, trying not to think about the fact that on the road from Lee, he just watched the world step a little closer to the stories his grandmother used to tell.